Tuesday, 8:47 p.m. The climate-controlled server room on the 42nd floor of the Chicago Financial Exchange building held a steady, unforgiving temperature of exactly 64 degrees. The cold was a physical presence, a sharp entity that gnawed at the edges of Jackson Cole's faded denim jacket, keeping his mind suspended in a state of absolute crystalline focus. Rows of black metallic racks stretched into the dimness, blinking with thousands of synchronized LED indicators. A digital heartbeat pulsing through miles of fiber optic veins. Jackson sat hunched in a worn, ergonomic chair, his dark hands resting lightly over the mechanical keyboard. The scars traversing his knuckles, souvenirs from years of wrestling with stubborn hardware and unforgiving server chassis, caught the pale blue glow of the trio of monitors dominating his workstation. He was a ghost in this glass and steel monolith, a contract IT specialist paid to be invisible, to ensure the rivers of capital flowed upward without interruption. He preferred the isolation. Silence demanded nothing, and shadows asked no questions about the grief that still hollowed out his chest 3 years after the cancer had taken his wife. The center monitor flickered, a microscopic stutter in the cascading lines of inbound packet sequencing. Most technicians would have dismissed it as a routine latency hiccup, a ghost in the machine born of heavy after-hours trading algorithms. Jackson did not dismiss anomalies. His eyes narrowed, tracking the pale green text scrolling against the absolute black of the terminal window. A lethargic engine turned over in his chest, shaking off the crushing monotony of corporate network auditing. He leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking loudly in the sterile quiet. He initiated a manual diagnostic protocol, his fingers flying across the keys with the practiced rhythmic violence of a concert pianist. The data stream fragmented, revealing the hidden architecture beneath the routine update protocols. There, a mirrored port on the proxy server, quietly siphoning outbound traffic to an unauthorized external IP address. Jackson's jaw tightened. Panic was a luxury reserved for those who didn't understand the machinery. He isolated the node, throwing up a temporary digital firewall to bottleneck the unauthorized exit point. The flow of stolen data slowed from a torrent to a trickle, but it did not stop. Whoever was on the other end had written an aggressive, self-mutating script designed to bypass standard perimeter defenses. They were carving out chunks of the executive drives, heavily encrypted financial ledgers, and offshore routing numbers. $10 million worth of proprietary algorithms and liquidity reserves were quietly walking out the back door. Jackson pulled the access logs. The intrusion wasn't an external brute force attack from some shadowy syndicate across the globe. The malware was tunneling directly through the localized drive of the chief executive officer, Sarah Mitchell. The immediate protocol required him to log the breach, alert the automated security matrix, and let the system initiate a hard wipe of the infected terminal to protect the broader network. Doing so would atomize the evidence, leaving the company safe but the identity of the thief permanently buried in corrupted ash. Jackson stared at the blinking cursor. A man's worth is measured in the quiet moments when no one is watching. Wiping the drive was the safe play. It was the procedure. But Jackson had spent his entire life watching the safe play protect the guilty while the innocent took the fall. He hit a sequence of keystrokes, freezing his own terminal. The problem required physical intervention. He had to sever the hard line directly at the source, trapping the malware inside the CEO's machine like a wasp in a jar, preserving the forensic trail before the thief realized the exit door had been bolted shut. The ascent to the 45th floor was a silent vertical journey into the rarefied atmosphere of extreme wealth. Jackson stepped out of the service elevator, his heavy rubber-soled boots sinking into carpeting thick enough to swallow the sound of a falling hammer. The air up here smelled different. Faint traces of ozone, lemon oil, and the sterile scent of power. The corridors were vast canyons of polished mahogany and frosted glass, utterly deserted save for the security cameras tracking his every movement with silent mechanical indifference. He navigated the labyrinth of assistant desks and waiting areas, a solitary figure of blue-collar utility moving through a cathedral of corporate excess. His pulse maintained a steady, measured rhythm. He was a man walking into a burning building, armed with nothing but cold logic and an uncompromising refusal to look the other way. The heavy double doors to the executive suite stood slightly ajar. A single sliver of golden light spilled out onto the dark carpet. Jackson approached, his hand reaching out to push the polished brass handle. He expected to find the office empty, the computer left running by a careless executive. He pushed the door open, slipping into the cavernous room. Sarah Mitchell sat behind a massive desk of reclaimed walnut, the glittering grid of the Chicago skyline sprawling out behind her through floor-to-ceiling windows. She was a woman whispered about in the lower floors with a mixture of reverence and terror. The Ice Queen, a corporate predator who could dismantle a rival firm or terminate 1,000 jobs without a shift in her perfectly calibrated posture. Tonight the armor was fractured. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, but the blazer was discarded over a chair, her pristine white blouse unbuttoned at the collar. She was leaning back in the heavy leather chair, her knees pulled up slightly, entirely oblivious to the monumental data heist occurring inside the machine resting inches from her fingertips. Jackson stepped fully into the room, the faint scent of server rack dust clinging to his clothes. He prepared to announce the breach, to demand access to the terminal, but the words died in his throat. Sarah wasn't looking at spreadsheets or quarterly projections. The ambient light of the laptop illuminated her face, catching the distinct, unmistakable gleam of tears tracking through her perfect makeup. Displayed on the high-resolution screen was a photograph from an elite society blog. It featured a man with silver-flecked hair and a devastatingly confident smile, Richard Preston, the company's chief financial officer. He had his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of a stunningly young, vibrantly smiling woman. A massive diamond caught the flash of the camera, a beacon of sudden, newly minted engagement. Jackson recognized the CFO instantly. He also knew the rumors. Richard Preston and Sarah Mitchell had been the ultimate corporate power couple, a union of ruthless ambition and shared ruthlessness right up until Preston had abruptly ended it 3 months ago. The silence in the office was absolute, brittle enough to shatter. Jackson stood frozen in the shadows, an unintended witness to the total collapse of a titan. He shifted his weight, the leather of his boots squeaking faintly against the polished hardwood border of the floor. Sarah's head snapped up. The vulnerability vanished instantly, sucked away into a void of practiced executive hostility. Her spine straightened, her hands dropping flat onto the desk, fingers splayed like weapons. She stared at the tall, broad-shouldered black man standing in her sanctuary, her eyes darting over his faded t-shirt and the heavy ID badge clipped to his belt. She didn't scream. She didn't call for security. The sheer audacity of his presence seemed to short-circuit her immediate rage, leaving behind a raw, bleeding edge of humiliation. She had been seen. The supreme architect of her own untouchable image had been caught drowning in the ashes of her personal life. The question slipped from her lips before the Ice Queen could fully reassert control, a ragged, desperate sound stripped of all corporate authority. "Is she prettier than me?" Jackson's chest tightened. He looked at the photograph glowing on the screen, the manufactured joy of the billionaire class, and then looked back at the woman sitting in the dark, clutching the ruins of her pride. He could have deflected. He could have apologized and retreated behind the impenetrable wall of his professional station. But Naomi had taught him that the deepest cruelty was allowing someone to suffer a lie when the truth could set them free. He held her gaze, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the cavernous room. "She has less dignity. That makes her entirely ordinary." Sarah flinched as if struck. The breath hitched in her throat, her perfectly manicured hands curling into tight, white-knuckled fists. The stark, uncompromising honesty of the statement severed the strange paralysis gripping the room. She blinked, the tears disappearing beneath a sudden, sharp clarity. The woman who dismantled conglomerates returned, her eyes narrowing as she processed the impossible presence of the man standing before her. "Who the hell are you and why are you in my office?" "Jackson Cole, infrastructure contractor." He didn't move toward her. He maintained his ground, projecting absolute stillness. "And right now, someone is using your machine to siphon $10 million in liquid assets out of the corporate holding accounts." The personal tragedy evaporated, instantly incinerated by the existential threat to her empire. Sarah stood up, the chair rolling back violently to crash against the glass wall. "That's impossible. My terminal is air-gapped from the primary treasury servers. The encryption is compromised." Jackson cut her off, his tone flat, devoid of the deference she was entirely accustomed to receiving. "It's a zero-day exploit riding on a localized update packet. They're tunneling out through an unauthorized port. If you touch that mouse, if you trigger a sleep state or close a window, the malware will likely execute a localized wipe to cover its tracks. Step away from the desk." She didn't move. The instinct to command, to control the environment, warred with the terrifying reality of his words. "I don't know you. I don't know if you're the one running the exploit. If I were running it, I'd be on a beach in the Caymans right now, not standing in Chicago trying to stop you from destroying the evidence." Jackson took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I need the keyboard, now." The absolute authority in his voice left no room for negotiation. It was the tone of a man who dealt in the hard, immutable laws of code and consequence, a man entirely immune to her wealth and title. Sarah stepped aside, her arms crossing tightly over her chest, a defensive posture shielding a heart that had been battered twice in the span of 10 minutes. Jackson moved into the space she vacated. The leather of her chair still held the warmth of her body. He didn't sit. He leaned over the polished wood, his massive hands hovering over the ultra-thin keyboard. He bypassed the graphic interface entirely, dropping into the command line. A black box opened over the smiling face of Richard Preston and his new fiancée. Jackson's fingers moved in a rapid staccato burst. He wasn't just observing the network traffic now, he was wrestling with it, grabbing the digital threads and pulling them taut. "I'm severing the outbound connection at the hardware protocol level," he narrated, his eyes tracking lines of code that moved too fast for a normal human to read. "It's going to shock the system." He hit the execution key. The laptop screen went entirely black. A split second later, the ambient lights in the executive suite flickered and died, plunging the room into profound darkness save for the pale moonlight filtering through the glass skyline. A heavy mechanical thud echoed through the walls, followed by the distinctive metallic slide of heavy deadbolts engaging. The automated security matrix had detected the sudden, violent termination of the data flow and reacted exactly as programmed. The red emergency indicator above the heavy double doors blinked to life, casting a sinister, pulsing glow over the carpet. "What did you just do?" Sarah's voice spiked in the darkness, the edge of panic finally breaking through the ice. "I trapped it." Jackson didn't look away from the screen as it slowly rebooted into a safe mode diagnostic environment. The localized security policy automatically initiates a hard physical lockdown when a severe extraction is interrupted manually. The doors are magnetically sealed. For how long? Until I can rebuild the encryption keys from scratch and prove to the system that the terminal is clean, or until the automated purge executes at midnight as a final security measure. He stood up straight, turning to face her in the red-tinted gloom. "We're locked in. We have 3 hours to untangle this, or your entire drive burns." Sarah stared at the heavy doors, the reality of the entrapment settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She was trapped in a glass cage suspended 1,000 feet above the city, entirely at the mercy of a stranger in faded denim with the ruins of her career and her personal life laid bare before him. She walked toward the windows, putting distance between them, her silhouette sharp against the glittering backdrop of the city. "Do it then." Her voice was a fragile whisper attempting to masquerade as a command. "Rebuild the keys." Jackson sat down in the executive chair. The leather groaned under his weight. He cracked his knuckles, a sharp, violent sound in the quiet room. "It's not just rebuilding. I have to parse the corrupted packets to find the origin point. Whoever built this didn't just want the money. They wanted the digital footprint to point directly to your localized drive. This was an assassination." He plunged into the digital wreckage. The next 40 minutes were an exercise in grueling, microscopic precision. He sifted through millions of lines of hexadecimal garbage, searching for the singular flaw, the arrogant oversight that every hacker eventually made. Sarah paced the length of the office, the rhythmic click of her heels against the hardwood border providing a metronomic underscore to his typing. The tension between them was a physical pressure in the room, the friction of two entirely different worlds forced into violent collision. She was motion, ambition, and perpetual vibrating anxiety. He was stillness, logic, and calculated, immovable restraint. "You're sweating." She stopped behind him, close enough that he could smell the faint, expensive trace of jasmine perfume. "It's 68 degrees in here. Hash decryption requires significant processing power." Jackson didn't stop typing, his eyes locked on the cascading data. "The CPU is running hot. It vents out the back." "I meant you." Jackson paused, his fingers hovering above the keys. He wiped the back of his hand across his forehead. She was right. The cold logic of the machine was warring with the furious heat of the hunt. He had found a thread, a tiny, nearly invisible string of metadata buried deep within the routing protocols. It was a secondary authorization token, a digital key used to unlock the firewall from the inside so the malware could slip through. It was heavily masked, bounced through a dozen internal relays, but it carried a unique, unalterable biometric signature. "I have the origin node." He executed a final extraction command. The screen cleared, displaying a single line of text in stark white against the black background. "Authorized credential, Preston_R_CFO." The silence that followed was absolute. Jackson leaned back in the chair, the leather sighing. He didn't look at Sarah. He let the glowing letters do the work. The cruelty of the revelation was staggering. Richard Preston hadn't just broken her heart. He hadn't just humiliated her publicly with a new, younger fiancé. He was actively, systematically attempting to send her to federal prison to cover his own multi-million-dollar theft. He was using the access she had trusted him with to destroy her completely. A sharp, ragged intake of breath shattered the quiet. Jackson turned his head slowly. Sarah was staring at the screen, her face drained of all color, her eyes wide with a horrific, devastating comprehension. The armor didn't just crack this time, it shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The betrayal was so absolute, so thoroughly encompassing that it defied anger. It bypassed rage and went straight to a profound, hollow agony. Her knees buckled. Jackson moved with explosive speed. He was out of the chair and across the space before she hit the floor, his large hands gripping her shoulders, bearing her weight. She didn't fight him. She slumped against his chest, a shuddering, violent tremor racking her entire body. She didn't cry. The shock was too deep for tears. It was the physical manifestation of a soul being ripped entirely in half. "Breathe." Jackson's voice was a low, steady rumble right beside her ear. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He offered the only thing he had, physical grounding in a reality that was spinning out of control. 5 seconds in. Hold it. 5 seconds out. Do it. She gasped. A ragged, drowning sound and followed his command. the scent of ozone and server dust mixed with the jasmine. She clung to the sleeves of his denim jacket, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the thick fabric. For a minute that stretched into eternity, they stayed like that in the red-lit darkness, the CEO and the contractor, bound together by the sudden, violent exposure of absolute treachery. The vibration against Jackson's thigh was a jarring, mechanical intrusion. His cell phone was ringing. The sudden noise snapped the fragile tether between them. Sarah pulled back, her chest heaving, her eyes darting away as the humiliation of her collapse rushed in to replace the shock. She smoothed her skirt with shaking hands, stepping back into the shadows. Jackson reached into his pocket, pulling out the battered smartphone. The screen glared brightly in the dim room. Caller ID, Mrs. Higgins. Jackson's blood turned to ice in his veins. The corporate espionage, the millions of dollars, the shattered woman standing a few feet away, all of it vanished, instantly obliterated by the primal, terrifying reality of fatherhood. Mrs. Higgins was the night nurse. She only called if the parameters failed. He swiped the screen, lifting the phone to his ear. "Jackson." The older woman's voice was tight, vibrating with suppressed panic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's Chloe. Her breathing is shallow. The pulse oximeter dropped to 88. I elevated her head, but she's lethargic. Her lips are losing color." The world tilted on its axis. The red emergency light above the door seemed to pulse with the failing rhythm of his 7-year-old daughter's defective heart. The congenital defect they had been battling since she was born. The ticking clock inside her chest that dictated every choice he made, every extra hour he worked, every ounce of dignity he swallowed to keep the medical insurance active. "Did you administer the sublingual nitro?" Jackson's voice stripped away all emotion, becoming a sterile operational instrument. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. "Yes, 2 minutes ago. It's barely moving the needle. Jackson, she needs the hospital. We are out of the safety margin." The magnetic deadbolts of the office doors loomed in his peripheral vision. A physical cage. He could smash the glass of the interior conference wall. He could trigger the manual fire override. He could batter his way out of this high-rise and be in his 10-year-old sedan in 4 minutes. He could race through the Chicago streets and hold his daughter's hand, while the paramedics fought for her life. But doing so would instantly sever the power to the executive grid. The automated purge protocol would execute immediately. The encrypted ghost drive he was building to trap Richard Preston would vanish into the ether. Sarah Mitchell would be left holding the smoking gun of a $10 million embezzlement scheme, with her own credentials stamped on the exit logs. The FBI would arrest her before the week was out. "Jackson?" The nurse's voice cracked. "What do I do?" He looked at Sarah. She had stopped pacing. She was watching him, the stark terror in his eyes finally mirroring her own. She saw the agonizing war raging behind his stoic mask. "Call 911. The words tasted like ash. Handing his daughter's life over to strangers was a profound, unnatural violation of every instinct he possessed. "Tell them it's a pediatric cardiac patient, congenital septal defect, active acute cyanosis. Have them transport her to Mount Sinai Pediatric Intensive Care. I will meet you there." "Daddy?" A small, incredibly weak voice drifted through the speaker, replacing the nurse. Jackson closed his eyes. The physical pain in his chest was absolute. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Are you fighting the bad guys at work?" The innocent wisdom of a child who viewed the world through the stark binary lens of heroes and villains. A child who slept with a stuffed unicorn and believed her father was invincible. "I am, Chloe. I'm fighting them right now." "Win, Daddy. Mommy said you always win." The memory of Naomi in the sterile hospice bed, her hand frail and cold in his, making him promise to raise their daughter with integrity, to teach her that the right choice is rarely the easy choice. Dignity is not a currency you can trade for comfort. "I will, baby." Mrs. Higgins is going to take you for a ride with the flashing lights. You be brave for me. I'm coming as fast as I can." He ended the call. The silence rushed back into the room, heavier and darker than before. He stared at the black screen of the phone. The lock screen illuminated, a picture of Chloe, gap-toothed and grinning wildly, wearing her bright pink medical alert bracelet like a badge of honor. Sarah took a slow step forward. The glow of the phone illuminated her face. She looked at the picture of the little girl, then up at the giant of a man whose hands were shaking imperceptibly. The architecture of her understanding completely realigned. She saw the magnitude of what was happening. This man, a blue-collar contractor she didn't even know existed 2 hours ago, was actively choosing to stay in a locked room to save her from total destruction while his only child was being loaded into an ambulance. "You have to go." The command was absolute, stripped of all corporate pretense. "Break the glass, override the lock, go to your daughter." Jackson slid the phone into his pocket. The screen went dark. He turned back to the terminal, pulling the keyboard toward him. "If I break the circuit, the drive wipes. Preston gets away with it. You take the fall." "I don't care about the company." Sarah's voice rose, desperate, furious at his stubborn sacrifice. "I don't care about the money. She is your daughter. You cannot stay here for me." Jackson didn't look up. His fingers resumed their rapid, violent assault on the keys. He was compiling the decryption hash, locking the forensic evidence into a permanent, unalterable state. "My daughter needs a father who doesn't run away when the dark closes in. She needs a man who finishes what he starts. Preston relies on people like you and me acting out of panic. He relies on the system breaking us down so we abandon our posts. I am not abandoning my post." The sheer, monumental weight of his integrity crashed over her. Sarah Mitchell, a woman who had spent her entire adult life surrounded by men who would sell their own mothers for a fractional percentage point of stock, was witnessing a display of honor so profound it defied logic. She stared at the broad, immovable line of his shoulders, the worn denim, the scars on his hands. He was building a fortress of code to protect her, brick by digital brick, while his own heart was breaking miles away. "How long?" Her voice was a cracked whisper. She moved to stand directly beside him, not pacing, not pulling away, but anchoring herself to his presence. 30 minutes to compile the hash and save the ghost drive. Then the automated system will recognize the terminal as clean and release the magnetic locks. 30 minutes. Sarah looked at the digital clock glowing faintly on the wall. 9:42 p.m. She reached out, a hesitant, incredibly slow movement, and rested her hand lightly on the edge of the desk, inches from his arm. It was the only support she knew how to offer. "Then we finish this in 30 minutes. The room settled into a tense, agonizing rhythm. The only sounds were the furious clattering of mechanical keys and the synchronized, shallow breathing of two strangers locked in a glass box above the city. Jackson's mind was bifurcated. Half of his consciousness was buried deep in the hexadecimal architecture, hunting down every fragmented piece of Richard Preston's malware, encrypting the stolen data and binding it to the CFO's permanent digital signature. The other half was in the back of a screaming ambulance, watching the color drain from a small, gap-toothed face, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to since Naomi died to hold the line just a little longer. The cold in the room seemed to intensify. The red emergency light pulsed, a relentless visual reminder of the ticking clock. Sarah watched the screen, watching the progress bar crawl across the black terminal with agonizing slowness. 10%, 20%. She didn't understand the code, but she understood the sheer force of will required to execute it under this magnitude of pressure. Why did he do it? Jackson's voice broke the synths rough and low. He wasn't asking for himself. He was forcing her to verbalize the trauma, to drag the monster out from under the bed so she could look at it in the light. Sarah swallowed hard. The engagement photo still hovered in her memory, a cruel, mocking ghost, because I was going to expose his restructuring plan. He wanted to liquidate the pensions to fund a corporate acquisition that would guarantee his golden parachute. I told him I was taking the evidence to the board tomorrow. Jackson hit the enter key, executing a complex loop. So he accelerated his timeline, siphon the capital tonight, frame you for the theft, and let the ensuing scandal bury your accusations. By the time the dust settles, he's married to the chairman's daughter and sitting on a beach with 10 million in untraceable crypto. He knew I would be working late. He knew I would be logged into the localized drive. The bitterness in her voice was absolute, a toxic sludge of regret and fury. He used the dedication he claimed to love against me. He used your predictability. He assumed you would panic when the money moved. He assumed you would trigger the automated wipe to cover the tracks out of sheer self-preservation, destroying the evidence of his involvement in the process. Jackson's fingers paused for a fraction of a second. He didn't account for a contractor sitting in the basement watching the packet sequence. He didn't account for a man who refuses to compromise his dignity. Sarah looked at him, the Ice Queen persona entirely dissolved, leaving behind a woman fiercely awake to the reality of the man beside her. 70%, 80%. The time stretched, warping and bending around the gravity of their shared entrapment. Jackson's phone remained silent in his pocket, a heavy, terrifying absence of information. No news was supposed to be good news, but in the realm of pediatric cardiology, silence usually meant a frantic, desperate battle where no one had time to dial a number. He focused every ounce of his terror into the keyboard, driving the encryption process forward with brutal efficiency. Jackson! He didn't look away from the screen. 90%. When this is over. When the doors open. Sarah's voice carried a new weight, a resolve born from the ashes of her shattered reality. I am going to destroy him. Not just for what he tried to do to me, but for making you stay in this room while your daughter is fighting for her life. I will dismantle his entire existence. It wasn't a threat. It was a corporate execution ordered in advance. Jackson hit the final command string. The progress bar slammed to 100%. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding white, then reverted to the standard, innocuous desktop background. The unauthorized port was sealed. The stolen data was retrieved, encrypted, and locked in a localized vault with Richard Preston's digital fingerprints burned permanently into the metadata. A heavy metallic thunk echoed through the suite. The red emergency light above the double doors clicked off, replaced by the standard green exit indicator. The magnetic deadbolts retracted with a sharp hiss. The automated protocol had accepted the clean terminal. They were free. Jackson didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy external hard drive where he had backed up the ghost file, shoving it into his canvas messenger bag. He stood up, towering over the desk, the physical exertion of the last hour leaving him breathing heavily. He looked at Sarah. She was standing perfectly still, watching him prepare to sprint into the night. The evidence is heavily encrypted, passphrase protected. Even the automated sweep won't detect it now. Jackson threw the strap of the bag over his shoulder. Preston thinks he won. He thinks the money is gone and you're holding the bag. Let him walk into the office tomorrow morning believing he holds all the cards. And you? Sarah asked, stepping around the desk, closing the distance between them. I have a fight of my own to finish. Jackson turned and walked toward the heavy double doors. He didn't run, maintaining a rapid, purposeful stride that spoke of contained, kinetic power. He pushed through the doors, stepping out into the hushed, dimly lit expanse of the 45th floor. He didn't look back. The air in the corridor felt different now, no longer a sterile vacuum of wealth, but a battlefield waiting for the dawn. He hit the elevator call button, his hand flat against the cold steel panel, his mind already projecting the route to Mount Sinai, calculating the traffic, visualizing the hospital room, praying that the gap-toothed smile would be there to greet him. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Jackson stepped inside. As the doors began to close, sliding silently together to seal him in for the rapid descent to the ground floor, he caught a final glimpse of the executive suite. Sarah Mitchell was standing in the doorway of her office. The darkness of the unlit room framed her silhouette against the distant glow of the city lights. She wasn't the Ice Queen anymore. She was a woman who had just survived a profound existential assassination, standing in the ruins of her old life, holding the weapon Jackson had forged for her. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply stood perfectly straight, her chin lifted, watching the man who had risked his absolute universe to protect hers disappear behind the closing steel doors. The descent was a free fall in the dark. Friday morning broke over Chicago not with warmth, but with a brittle, blinding light that struck the glass towers of the financial district like a physical blow. Sarah Mitchell gripped the leather steering wheel of her imported sedan, her knuckles white, navigating the sprawling concrete arteries that bled out from the opulent center of the city toward the working-class grid of the South Side. The transition of wealth was architectural and immediate. Gleaming steel monoliths gave way to weathered brick walk-ups, cramped bodegas and chain-link fences holding back the relentless creep of urban decay. She did not belong here. Her tailored cashmere coat and the silent, insulated cabin of her vehicle were alien artifacts in a neighborhood where survival was a daily, unglamorous mathematics. Yet, resting on the passenger seat was a crisp, certified cashier's check, bearing a sum that could alter the gravitational pull of a human life: $150,000. The piece of paper represented her entire worldview. In the upper echelons of corporate warfare, capital was the ultimate universal solvent. It dissolved liabilities, purchased loyalty, and paved over the deepest of betrayals. Richard Preston had weaponized the system against her, but she still wielded the raw, concussive power of her personal wealth. She intended to use it to settle a debt. Jackson Cole had stood between her and absolute annihilation in a locked server room, sacrificing his own daughter's critical moments to forge an impenetrable digital shield around her career. Buying the little girl's congenital heart surgery was not charity. It was an executive balancing of the ledger. It was the only language Sarah knew how to speak fluently. She parked beneath the rusting iron skeleton of the elevated train tracks. The rhythmic thunder of the morning commute vibrated through the soles of her designer boots as she stepped onto the cracked pavement. Number 412 was a towering, century-old tenement building, its masonry scarred by brutal winters and decades of neglect. She bypassed the broken intercom, pushing through the heavy wooden door, and began the grueling ascent to the 4th floor. The stairwell smelled of old brass, boiled coffee, and the faint, stinging antiseptic tang of industrial floor cleaner. Each step stripped away another layer of her corporate armor. She was entirely stripped of her boardroom authority, reduced to a solitary woman carrying a piece of paper up a darkened stairwell, her heart hammering a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. Jackson Cole opened the door before she could knock. The man filling the narrow doorframe looked as though he had been carved directly from the bedrock of the city. He wore a faded gray thermal shirt and worn denim, his broad shoulders practically touching the jambs. The exhaustion in his dark eyes was absolute, a profound, bone-deep weariness that transcended mere lack of sleep. He had spent the last 48 hours oscillating between the sterile terror of a pediatric intensive care unit and the invisible digital trenches of a corporate war zone. Yet his spine remained perfectly straight, an unyielding vertical line of sheer willpower. "You're far from the Gold Coast." The drive gave me time to think. Sarah stepped past him as he stepped back, entering a living space that forced an immediate, overwhelming intimacy. The apartment was suffocatingly small but immaculately kept. The worn floorboards gleamed with recent polishing. A small humming refrigerator stood adjacent to a cramped galley kitchen where the scent of cinnamon and butter fought against the pervasive, terrifying reality of a portable oxygen concentrator humming in the corner. Medical tubing lay coiled on a small dining table like a translucent serpent. The walls were covered not in art, but in crayon drawings, vibrant, chaotic explosions of color depicting stood unicorns and stick figure families. It was a fortress of love built entirely inside a shoebox, defending against a world that demanded too much. Sarah opened her designer purse. The metallic click of the clasp was deafening in the quiet room. She retrieved the pristine envelope and extended it toward his chest. The hospital administration requires a 90% upfront deposit for the septal defect reconstruction because your contractor insurance classifies it as a pre-existing condition. Her voice was clipped, operating on the familiar frequencies of an acquisition merger. This covers the surgery, the specialized pediatric ICU recovery wing, and the outpatient physical therapy for 6 months. The funds are cleared. You just have to hand it to the billing department. Jackson did not look at the envelope. He looked directly into her eyes. The temperature in the tiny room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "Put it away." The command was a low, gravelly rumble devoid of anger but vibrating with an absolute, terrifying finality. Sarah's hand remained suspended in the space between them. The circuitry of her brain misfired. She had anticipated gratitude, perhaps a tearful collapse, or even a stubborn, prideful hesitation that could be easily overcome with a few sharp logical arguments. She had not anticipated the impenetrable wall of his gaze. "It isn't charity. You saved me from federal prison. You saved my legacy. This is an equitable exchange of value. My daughter's heartbeat is not a commodity to be traded on your ledger." Jackson took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing her to look up to maintain eye contact. "I am not a charity case, and I am not an employee you can bonus into submission. I have dignity. I deserve respect. Do not bring your corporate checkbook into my home and attempt to purchase my salvation." The words struck her like physical blows. The unassailable moral clarity in his voice shattered the fragile paradigm she had constructed. In her world, everyone had a price. Everyone could be bought, managed, or compensated. Jackson Cole was operating under a code of honor she had long ago dismissed as an archaic myth. To him, accepting a handout from a billionaire to save his own flesh and blood wasn't salvation. It was an absolute surrender of his agency. It was an admission that a working-class father was insufficient. "She is dying, Jackson," Sarah's voice cracked, the Ice Queen persona entirely dissolving under the immense, crushing weight of his pride. "Do not let your ego dig a grave for a 7-year-old child." Jackson's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained against the thermal fabric of his shirt. For a terrifying second, she thought he was going to open the door and order her out into the Chicago wind. Instead, he closed his eyes, inhaling a deep, ragged breath that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the cramped room. When he opened them, the defensive fury had receded, replaced by the calculating precision of a man who solved impossible architectural problems for a living. "I will not take a handout." He reached out, his scarred, calloused fingers wrapping gently but firmly around her wrist, pushing the envelope down. "But I will accept terms. You will draft a legally binding promissory note, standard market interest rate, a 10-year amortization schedule. It will be a formal loan, collateralized against my future earnings and my life insurance policy. We sign it in front of a notary. I pay back every cent." It was an absurd proposition. The interest on a loan of that magnitude would yoke him to crushing debt for a decade. But as Sarah looked at the fierce, unbroken light in his eyes, she finally understood. He was not protecting his ego. He was protecting his right to stand before his daughter as a provider, as a man who bore the weight of his family on his own 2 shoulders without bowing to the aristocracy. Standard market interest. Sarah nodded slowly, slipping the envelope back into her purse. "I'll have corporate counsel draft the papers by noon." A small scraping sound echoed from the narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms. Sarah turned. Standing in the doorway was a tiny, fragile figure wearing oversized flannel pajamas. Chloe Cole clutched a battered stuffed unicorn under one arm, her other hand resting against the doorframe for balance. Her skin carried a faint, terrifying pallor, a subtle blueness around her lips that indicated the failing engine inside her chest. But her large brown eyes were incredibly sharp, taking in the stranger in the expensive coat with unfiltered, intense curiosity. "Daddy, you're talking loud!" Jackson's entire physical bearing transformed instantly. The rigid, unyielding titan melted into a posture of profound, agonizing gentleness. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, dropping to one knee before the little girl, adjusting the collar of her pajamas. "I'm sorry, baby, we were just negotiating a contract. How is your chest today?" "It feels like a tight sweater." Chloe looked past her father's shoulder, her gaze locking onto Sarah. She offered a wide, gap-toothed smile that possessed the sudden, devastating power to illuminate the gloomy tenement. "Are you the boss lady from the tall building?" "I am." Sarah stepped forward, feeling entirely out of her depth. She could command a room of hostile shareholders, but the earnest, unbroken gaze of a sick child stripped away every rhetorical weapon in her arsenal. "My name is Sarah." Chloe released the doorframe and took 2 slow, measured steps forward. She didn't extend her hand for a shake. Instead, she reached out and poked the sleeve of Sarah's cashmere coat. "You're the lady with no smile." Jackson exhaled a sharp breath. "Chloe, manners." "It's okay." Sarah knelt down, her designer skirt pooling against the worn floorboards. The proximity to the child brought the faint scent of baby shampoo and sterile medical tape. "Why do you say I have no smile?" "Because your eyes look like you forgot how." Chloe tilted her head, a miniature philosopher rendering absolute judgment. "My mom used to say that people who keep everything too perfect are just afraid of the mess. But the mess is where all the living happens." The breath caught in Sarah's throat. The child's wisdom sliced through decades of carefully constructed psychological armor. Richard Preston's betrayal had been the ultimate mess, a catastrophic disruption of her perfect, sterile trajectory. She had spent the last 3 days trying to freeze the world, to lock down the perimeter, to re-establish absolute control. But sitting on the floor of a cramped apartment in the South Side, looking into the eyes of a little girl whose very existence was a chaotic, beautiful struggle against mortality, Sarah realized the profound emptiness of her own perfection. "I think your mom was a very smart woman. She was the smartest." Chloe held out the stuffed unicorn, offering it to Sarah like a sacred relic. "You can hold Barnaby. He helps when you feel empty inside." Sarah took the battered toy. The plush fabric was worn thin from years of frantic, terrified clutching in hospital waiting rooms. Holding it, the dam finally broke. A single silent tear spilled over her lower lash line, tracking through her makeup. She didn't wipe it away. For the first time in 10 years, the Ice Queen allowed someone to witness the thaw. The morning dissolved into a strange, beautiful domestic intimacy that Sarah had never experienced. She stayed for breakfast, sitting at the cramped table while Jackson maneuvered through the tiny kitchen, flipping pancakes with practiced efficiency. There were no discussions of corporate strategy, no forensic analysis of network architecture. The conversation was dictated entirely by a 7-year-old girl's cosmology. They discussed the probability of life on other planets, the optimal ratio of syrup to pancake, and the distinct artistic merits of coloring outside the lines. Sarah found herself laughing, a real unpolished sound that felt foreign and abrasive in her own throat. She watched Jackson slice a pancake into microscopic squares for his daughter, noting the incredible precision of his scarred hands. He caught her looking, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment the air between them thickened. The shared trauma of the locked server room had forged a structural bond, But the quiet rhythm of this kitchen was building something infinitely more dangerous. Trust. She did not leave when the plates were cleared. She stayed through the afternoon, a silent observer in a world governed by medication schedules and oxygen saturation levels. When the early autumn dusk settled over the city, casting long gray shadows through the narrow windows, Chloe's energy plummeted. The vibrant philosopher faded into a fragile, exhausted patient. Jackson carried her to the bedroom, a tiny space dominated by a heavy medical bed and blinking monitors. Sarah hovered in the doorway, clutching her purse, feeling the sudden urge to retreat to the safety of her penthouse. "Read to me, Daddy." Chloe's voice was a reedy whisper. Jackson reached for a worn paperback resting on the nightstand, but paused. He looked over his shoulder at the woman standing in the shadows. He didn't issue a command, nor did he beg. He simply offered an invitation across the chasm of their respective worlds. "Sarah, do you want to take the first chapter?" She stepped into the room. Her hands trembled as she took the book from his massive grip. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning softly. She opened the book, her voice initially stiff, carrying the cadence of a quarterly earnings report. But as she read the story of a brave mouse navigating an enormous, terrifying world, her tone softened. She leaned in, her shoulder brushing against Jackson's arm where he sat on a folding chair beside the bed. By the time the chapter ended, Chloe's breathing had leveled into the deep, rhythmic cadence of sleep. Sarah closed the book carefully, setting it down. She looked at the little girl's face, peaceful and unguarded, and felt a sudden, violent surge of protective fury. This child deserved to grow up. She deserved to see the world. Jackson stood up, gesturing toward the door. They walked back into the cramped living room, the silence between them no longer a battleground, but a shared sanctuary. "Thank you." Jackson stood near the door, the ambient light from the street lamp casting half his face in shadow. "For today, for the book, for not pushing the check. The lawyers will have the loan documents ready by Monday morning." Sarah pulled her coat tightly around herself, suddenly terrified of the vulnerability she had left exposed in this apartment. "I will see you at the office, Jackson." "I'll be there." She walked down the 4 flights of stairs, the scent of cinnamon fading, replaced by the cold reality of the Chicago night. She unlocked her car and sat behind the steering wheel for a long time before starting the engine. The Ice Queen was dead. The woman driving back to the Gold Coast was awake, terrified and ready to burn Richard Preston's empire to the ground, to protect the 2 people she had just left behind. Monday afternoon arrived with the subtlety of a guillotine blade dropping. Jackson sat in his windowless cubicle on the 42nd floor, compiling the final encrypted dossier of Richard Preston's embezzlement. The digital ghost drive he had built in Sarah's office was flawless. The forensic trail led directly from the offshore Cayman's accounts, through the dummy corporations, right back to the CFO's personal biometric authorization tokens. He had locked the file behind a rotating 256-bit encryption key. It was a loaded gun waiting to be handed to the board of directors. His desktop terminal chimed. A priority notification from the automated human resources portal flashed across the screen. Subject: immediate termination of contract and benefits. Jackson's hand froze over the mouse. He clicked the icon. The sterile, legally mandated text filled the monitor. His independent contractor agreement had been terminated for unspecified security protocol violations. He was required to surrender his badge and vacate the premises within 15 minutes. But it was the second paragraph that stopped the blood in his veins. Pursuant to the immediate termination of your contract, all affiliated corporate health insurance provisions, including the emergency bridge coverage extension for dependents, are hereby revoked, effective immediately. COBRA documentation will be mailed to your physical address. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a violent, silent gasp. The room began to spin. Tomorrow. Chloe's surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. tomorrow morning at Mount Sinai. The pre-op prep had already begun. The surgical team had been mobilized. The donor valves had been prepped. Without the corporate insurance umbrella guaranteeing the massive financial outlay, the hospital administration would flag the account. The billing department would halt the procedure. His daughter would be sent home with a failing heart to wait in the purgatory of the state Medicaid lottery. Richard Preston had not just fired him. He had aimed a sniper rifle directly at a 7-year-old girl's chest and pulled the trigger. Jackson stood up. His chair crashed backward into the partition. He didn't gather his personal belongings. He didn't lock his terminal. He grabbed the encrypted flash drive containing the dossier, shoved it deep into the pocket of his denim jacket, and walked toward the elevator banks. The peripheral noise of the corporate floor, ringing phones, hushed conversations, the clacking of keyboards, faded into a dull, roaring white noise in his ears. The descent to the underground parking garage was an eternity locked in a steel box. When the doors finally parted, the subterranean air was thick with exhaust and damp concrete. Jackson strode aggressively toward his battered sedan, his mind frantically calculating the impossible geometry of raising $150,000 in cash in under 14 hours. The loan documents with Sarah were not finalized. The corporate bureaucracy had dragged its feet. He was entirely, fundamentally exposed. "It's a brutal system, isn't it, Jackson?" The voice echoed sharply off the low concrete ceiling. Jackson stopped. Standing beside the driver's side door of his sedan was Richard Preston. The chief financial officer looked immaculate. His bespoke navy suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair catching the harsh fluorescent light of the garage. He leaned casually against the rusted quarter panel of Jackson's car, projecting the relaxed, predatory confidence of an apex predator who had successfully cornered his prey. Two massive, silent men in dark suits stood a discreet 20 feet away, blocking the exit ramp. Private security. You triggered a tripwire in the localized mainframe when you built that ghost drive on Friday night. Richard inspected his manicured fingernails. You're good, Jackson. Truly exceptional. Most of the apes in the IT department wouldn't have caught the routing anomaly. But you made a mistake. You assumed you could outmaneuver the man who owns the board. Jackson didn't move. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, vibrating with a primal, violent urge to cross the 6 feet of asphalt and crush the CFO's throat. He forced the animal rage down, burying it under a mountain of cold, calculating ice. You cut my daughter's insurance. I initiated a routine audit of contractor liabilities. Richard smiled, a terrifying display of perfectly capped teeth. The timing is incredibly unfortunate. I understand your little girl requires specialized cardiothoracic intervention tomorrow morning. Heartbreaking, really. The American healthcare system is notoriously unforgiving to the working class. What do you want, Preston? Richard reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. He withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope and tossed it onto the hood of Jackson's car. It landed with a heavy, substantial thud. Inside that envelope is a bearer bond drawn on an untraceable Swiss account. $1 million, liquid. Richard stepped away from the car, gesturing expansively. Furthermore, if you log into your portal right now, you will see a reinstated permanent executive tier health insurance policy retroactive to this morning. The hospital is already pre-authorizing the surgery as we speak. Your daughter gets a brand new heart. You become a wealthy man. Jackson stared at the envelope. It was a rectangular piece of paper that held the power of life and death. And the price? The price is the truth, Jackson. The CFO's voice dropped, shedding the theatrical arrogance, revealing the cold, calculating machinery beneath. You will hand over the encrypted flash drive in your pocket. You will access the master server and initiate a complete, unrecoverable wipe of Sarah Mitchell's localized drive. And tomorrow afternoon, when the board of directors convenes to investigate the missing $10 million, You will testify that Sarah Mitchell instructed you to build a backdoor routing protocol to funnel the funds into her personal accounts. You will be the whistleblower who caught the corrupt CEO. The sheer monumental audacity of the proposition hung in the damp air. Richard Preston was not just asking him to look the other way. He was demanding that Jackson become the executioner. He was demanding that Jackson commit perjury, destroy an innocent woman, and actively participate in the systemic corruption he despised. You want me to frame her for your theft. I want you to be a pragmatist. Richard took a step closer. Sarah is finished regardless. If you fight me, I will tie this up in litigation for years. I have a team of lawyers who will bury you so deep in subpoenas you won't be able to breathe. You will go to prison for corporate espionage. Sarah will go to prison, and your daughter will die waiting on a bureaucratic waiting list. You are a father, Jackson. You know what the right choice is. Take the money, save your little girl, let the Ice Queen burn. Jackson looked at the envelope. $1 million. It was a number that defied comprehension for a man who budgeted his groceries to the nearest decimal. It meant escaping the crushing gravity of the South Side. It meant college funds, specialized tutors, a house with a yard where Chloe could run without fearing the exhaust fumes. It meant absolute, unassailable security. All it cost was his soul. He slowly reached out, his scarred hand hovering over the manila envelope. Richard Preston's smile widened, a victor observing the inevitable capitulation of a lesser man. The CFO nodded approvingly. We are men of the world, Jackson. We understand that honor doesn't pay the surgeon. Jackson's hand bypassed the envelope entirely. He grabbed the handle of his car door, pulling it open with a violent, screeching grind of rusted hinges. He looked at Richard Preston, his dark eyes entirely devoid of fear, radiating an absolute terrifying moral clarity. I can rebuild a broken career, Preston. Jackson's voice was a low rumble that echoed off the concrete pillars. I can dig ditches to pay for my daughter's care, but I cannot buy back my honor, and I will not buy her a new heart with a compromised soul. The smile vanished from Richard's face. The aristocratic confidence fractured, replaced by genuine, bewildered shock. You're signing her death warrant for a woman you barely know. I'm showing my daughter what a man looks like. Jackson slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, a guttural, furious sound. He threw the transmission into reverse, the tires screeching against the asphalt as he backed out, leaving the $1 million bearer bond sitting on the damp concrete. The drive to Mount Sinai Hospital was a blur of adrenaline and creeping existential terror. Jackson navigated the chaotic Chicago traffic automatically, his mind locked in a state of hyper-vigilant crisis. He had rejected the devil's bargain. He had kept his honor intact, but the reality of his choice was an impending catastrophic avalanche. In 12 hours, the hospital billing department would run the insurance code. The system would return a fatal error. The surgery would be canceled. He had chosen dignity over survival. And now he had to look his little girl in the eyes and explain why the bad guys were winning. He parked in the hospital garage and rode the elevator to the pediatric intensive care unit. The sterile, brightly lit corridors smelled of bleach and impending grief. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors of room 412. Chloe was sitting up in bed, surrounded by a fortress of pillows and beeping telemetry monitors. She looked incredibly small, a fragile spark of life tethered to a dozen translucent tubes. The pre-op fasting had left her pale, but her eyes were bright, tracking his massive frame as he stepped into the room. Jackson collapsed into the plastic chair beside her bed. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving behind a crushing, paralyzing despair. He reached out, taking her tiny, cold hand in his massive, scarred palms. He bowed his head, resting his forehead against her knuckles. The Titan had finally broken. The weight of the world had snapped his spine. "Daddy!" He couldn't speak. The words were choked behind a dam of unshed tears. He had failed her. He had chosen a rigid, unyielding moral code over her actual physical heartbeat. Chloe shifted, her small fingers weakly stroking the coarse hair at the nape of his neck. "Are you fighting the bad guys at work today?" The child's wisdom, innocent and devastating. Jackson raised his head. He looked at the crayon drawing taped to the side of the medical monitor. The stick figure of a giant man standing between a little girl and a scribbled dark monster. He swallowed the terror. He forced the air back into his lungs. "Yes, baby, I'm fighting them. Did you win?" Jackson looked at the encrypted flash drive resting heavily in the pocket of his jacket. The evidence. The truth. Richard Preston believed that capital conquered all, that morality was a luxury for the rich and a liability for the poor. But Jackson remembered Naomi's voice in the dark, reminding him that a man stripped of his integrity is a man who has already died. Not yet. Jackson squeezed her hand, his voice steadying, gathering a new, terrifying resolve. He would not surrender. He would not let Richard Preston dictate the terms of their survival. "But I'm going to. I promise you, Chloe. I'm going to win." He pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He brought up Sarah Mitchell's private number. He hit dial. The phone rang once, twice. "Jackson." Sarah's voice was sharp, immediate. "Preston fired me. He cut the insurance. He tried to buy the drive for $1 million in the parking garage." Jackson didn't waste time on pleasantries. He delivered the tactical assessment of a battlefield commander. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the receiver. "Are you safe? Where are you?" "I'm at the hospital." Jackson looked at his daughter, the fierce, unwavering trust in her eyes fueling a fire that would burn the corporate world to ash. "I have the encrypted drive. I have the biometric logs. He thinks he cornered me. He thinks I'm paralyzed. What do we do?" The Ice Queen was asking the contractor for orders. The hierarchy had entirely collapsed, replaced by the absolute meritocracy of survival. "Call an emergency session of the board of directors for 8 a.m. tomorrow morning." Jackson stood up, his towering silhouette casting a long shadow across the sterile room. "Tell them you are bringing irrefutable evidence of a hostile internal financial breach. Force Preston to sit in that room." "Jackson, if we miss, if the board protects him to save the stock price, we both go to federal prison." "Then we don't miss." Jackson's voice was stone and steel. "I can rebuild a career. I cannot buy back my honor. Call the board, Sarah. We're going to war." He ended the call. The dial tone echoed in the small hospital room. He looked back at Chloe. She was smiling, holding Barnaby the unicorn tightly against her chest. "You look scary, Daddy." "I'm not scary, baby." Jackson leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'm just finishing the story." Wednesday morning arrived, not with the gentle creep of dawn, but with the brutal, blinding glare of hospital fluorescence. The pediatric preoperative holding area at Mount Sinai was a symphony of terrifying mechanical rhythms. Ventilators hissed. Heart monitors beeped in rapid, erratic successions. Jackson Cole stood beside a narrow stainless steel bed, his massive hands resting gently on the aluminum safety rails. He wore a charcoal suit, 10 years out of style and tight across his broad shoulders, purchased for the darkest day of his life when he buried Naomi. Today it was not mourning attire, it was armor. Chloe lay beneath a thin, heated blanket, wearing a faded hospital gown decorated with cartoon bears that looked absurdly cheerful against the stark reality of cardiothoracic surgery. The blue tint around her lips was more pronounced this morning, the failing engine in her chest struggling to pump oxygen through her fragile frame. A network of translucent IV lines snaked from her tiny arms to a towering pole of saline and sedatives. The anesthesiologist, a quiet woman with kind eyes, was hovering near the monitor array, making final calibrations. The corporate insurance system had not yet flagged the termination order Richard Preston had executed the previous afternoon. Bureaucracy was a slow, lumbering beast, and Jackson was betting his daughter's life on the delay between a keystroke in a corporate tower and the billing department's morning audit. "Daddy, your suit is scratchy." Jackson leaned down, his cheek brushing against her forehead. The skin was cool, damp with the medication. He inhaled the scent of sterile alcohol wipes and the faint, lingering trace of the baby shampoo he had used to wash her hair the night before. "It's my fighting suit, baby. I told you I had to battle the bad guys today." Chloe's heavy eyelids fluttered. The pre-surgical sedatives were beginning to pull her into the dark. Her small fingers curled weakly around his thumb, lacking the strength to squeeze, but the intention was absolute. "You look like a hero, like the ones in the comic books." The absolute, unblemished trust in her voice was a physical weight, pressing against his sternum. He was leaving her. At the exact moment she was being wheeled into a sterile theater to have her chest opened. He was walking away to wage a war in a glass tower miles away. The guilt was an acid burning in the back of his throat. He wanted to tear off the suit, barricade the hospital door, and refuse to leave her side. But shielding her body without securing her future was a hollow victory. If he did not break Richard Preston today, the corporate machine would hunt them down, bankrupt them, and strip away every avenue of survival. "I need you to be the bravest girl in the world for the next few hours." Jackson's voice was a low, steady rumble, carefully scrubbed of the absolute terror threatening to drown him. "You listen to the doctors, you take a deep sleep, and when you wake up, I will be sitting right beside this bed, I promise you." "And V, the lady with no smile? She'll be here too." Chloe offered a slow, drug-heavy nod, her gap-toothed smile barely visible. "Good. She needs us to teach her how to laugh." The anesthesiologist stepped forward, a syringe poised above the primary IV port. The final countdown had begun. Jackson pressed his lips to Chloe's forehead, lingering for a long, agonizing second, committing the rhythm of her erratic heartbeat to memory. He released her hand. He stepped back as the surgical orderlies unlocked the wheels of the bed. They pushed her through the swinging double doors, taking his entire universe down a sterile, brightly lit corridor. Jackson stood entirely still for 60 seconds. He closed his eyes, centering the storm inside his chest. He locked the terror away in a dark, inaccessible vault. When he opened his eyes, the grieving father was gone. Only the warrior remained. Truth does not require an invitation. It only requires a witness. The drive into the financial district was a blur of aggressive Chicago traffic and the metallic gray of an impending storm. The towering glass monolith of the corporate headquarters loomed over the skyline, a monument to unchecked greed and insulated power. Jackson parked his rusted sedan 3 blocks away, paying the exorbitant meter fee, refusing to use the corporate garage where Richard Preston's private security might be waiting to intercept him. He walked the remaining distance, the cold wind whipping off Lake Michigan, snapping the lapels of his worn suit. He entered the grand lobby precisely at 7:50. The marble floors echoed with the sharp clicks of designer heels and the polished leather of Italian Oxfords. Jackson bypassed the main reception desk, heading straight for the executive elevators. He swiped his access badge. A red light flashed. Access denied. Credentials revoked. Richard Preston had locked the digital gates. Jackson did not break stride. He turned on his heel, joining the chaotic flow of the morning courier rush toward the freight elevators in the loading dock. He knew the building's circulatory system better than the architects who designed it. He slipped past the distracted loading dock supervisor, stepping into the massive, reinforced steel cage of the freight lift. He hit the manual override, using a sequence of maintenance codes he had memorized during his first week on the contract. The heavy doors shuttered and closed. The ascent was grinding and slow, a relentless upward crawl toward the apex of corporate power. The 45th floor was a study in aggressive silence. The mahogany-paneled corridors were devoid of the usual assistant chatter. The atmosphere was incredibly dense, thick with the electric tension of an impending execution. At the far end of the hallway, the heavy double oak doors of the primary boardroom stood closed. Two massive men in dark suits, the same private security contractors from the hospital parking garage, flanked the entrance, their hands resting casually near the hidden holsters beneath their jackets. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was toxic. A massive, elliptical table of polished African wenge wood dominated the space, surrounded by 20 high-backed leather chairs. The board of directors, a collection of profoundly wealthy, severely tailored men and women, sat in hushed, tense clusters. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the storm clouds rolling over the city, casting the room in a bruised, violet light. Sarah Mitchell stood entirely alone at the head of the table. She wore a severe, stark white blazer, her hair pulled back in a merciless knot. She projected absolute, uncompromising authority, but the isolation was palpable. She was surrounded by wolves, and the alpha was sitting directly across from her. Richard Preston leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water, his silver hair immaculate. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Jackson's sedan. He projected an aura of weary, aristocratic patience, the posture of a benevolent leader dealing with a hysterical subordinate. "We have indulged this emergency session, Sarah, out of respect for your past contributions." The chairman of the board, an elderly billionaire with pale reptilian eyes, checked a gold Patek Philippe watch. "But making wild accusations of systemic embezzlement against our chief financial officer requires immediate, irrefutable substantiation. If this is a tactical maneuver to obscure the missing Q3 liquidity, it is not a maneuver." Sarah's voice sliced through the heavy air, sharp and unyielding. "It is an extinction-level event for this firm if we do not amputate the infection immediately. Richard Preston has utilized unauthorized proxy servers to funnel $10 million in corporate assets into offshore accounts held under dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands." A murmur of genuine shock rippled around the table. Richard Preston did not flinch. He placed his glass down with a soft, dismissive click. "This is a tragic psychological breakdown." Richard's voice was smooth, dripping with weaponized empathy. "Sarah has been under immense, crushing pressure since our personal relationship concluded. The stress has clearly fractured her reality. She has fabricated this entire conspiracy to mask her own gross negligence. The funds were lost due to her reckless authorization of the secondary algorithms." He leaned forward, resting his manicured hands on the polished wood. "In fact, she manipulated a low-level contract IT worker into building a backdoor protocol to hide the losses, a man she was entirely too close to. I fired him yesterday for egregious security violations. This entire narrative is the desperate flailing of a compromised executive." The trap was elegantly constructed. Richard had woven the missing funds, her broken engagement, and her association with Jackson into a single devastating tapestry of professional incompetence and emotional instability. The board members shifted their allegiances immediately, their faces hardening into masks of corporate self-preservation. Sarah was suddenly standing on a crumbling precipice. The heavy oak doors at the end of the boardroom exploded open. The sound was a violent, concussive crack that silenced the room instantly. The two private security guards were shoved backward into the mahogany paneling, their faces registering profound, breathless shock. Jackson Cole stepped into the billionaire's sanctuary. He did not look like a low-level IT contractor. He did not look like a compromised subordinate. The worn charcoal suit stretched tight across his chest, his jaw locked in a rigid line of absolute defiance. He radiated a raw, uncompromising moral gravity that sucked the oxygen out of the room. He was the physical embodiment of the working class stepping out of the shadows to demand an accounting. "Security!" Richard Preston sprang from his chair, his aristocratic composure cracking violently. "Remove this man immediately. He is a terminated, hostile element. The guards lunged forward, reaching for Jackson's arms. Jackson didn't throw a punch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stopped, turning his massive frame to look down at the two men with eyes so devoid of fear, so completely filled with a terrifying, righteous absolute that the guards froze. The primal instinct of self-preservation overrode their corporate paychecks. They stepped back. A suit does not make a man, and a title does not grant him a spine. Jackson's voice rolled through the massive room, a deep, resonant thunder that rattled the crystal water glasses on the table. He walked past the guards, past the stunned billionaires, striding directly toward the massive projection screen at the front of the room. "Call the police!" Richard was shouting now, the panic finally breaking through the silver-haired veneer. "He is trespassing. He is dangerous. The only danger in this room is sitting in your chair, Preston." Jackson pulled the encrypted flash drive from his pocket. He slapped it onto the podium, slamming it into the master interface port. He bypassed the presentation software entirely, his thick fingers flying across the embedded keyboard with blinding, violent speed. The room watched in paralyzed silence as the massive, high-definition screen behind Sarah Mitchell flared to life. It was not a spreadsheet. It was a digital map of absolute ruin. Lines of cascading decrypted code flowed across the screen, translating in real time into a stark, undeniable visual flowchart. The architecture of the theft was laid bare in terrifying detail. "This is the corporate treasury." Jackson pointed to a massive blue node on the left side of the screen. He did not look at Sarah. He addressed the chairman directly, his tone carrying the cold, factual weight of an autopsy report. At 8:47 p.m. on Tuesday, an unauthorized script initiated a bulk transfer. The script bypassed the external firewalls because it was launched from inside the perimeter. Jackson hit another key. The flowchart expanded, a glowing red line tracking the stolen funds as they bounced through a labyrinth of proxy servers attempting to scrub their digital fingerprints. Richard Preston claims CEO Mitchell authorized this transfer, but network architecture does not lie, and it does not possess a survival instinct. It only records. Jackson executed the final decryption hash. The red line terminated at a massive, flashing offshore account icon. Below it, in stark, undeniable high-definition text, the biometric authorization logs populated the screen. Authorizing device Preston_private_mobile_01. Fingerprint hash match, 99.98% confidence. Secondary two-factor authentication, sent to Preston_R_CFO. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, brittle enough to shatter lungs. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was a mathematical certainty burned into the unalterable metadata of the corporate mainframe. He didn't just steal the capital. Jackson turned slowly, locking eyes with Richard Preston. The CFO was staring at the screen, his face entirely drained of blood, a corpse wearing a bespoke suit. He weaponized his access to frame an innocent woman, and yesterday afternoon in the parking garage of Mount Sinai Hospital, he offered me $1 million in untraceable bearer bonds to destroy this drive and commit perjury in this room. A collective gasp echoed around the Wengewood table. The chairman stood up, his reptilian eyes wide with a mixture of horror and legal liability. "Is this true, Richard?" The chairman's voice was a harsh, raspy whisper. Richard Preston looked at the faces of his peers. He saw the immediate, ruthless calculation in their eyes. He was no longer an asset. He was a massive, radioactive liability. The instinct for self-preservation that governed their entire existence dictated that he be severed immediately. The empire he had built on a foundation of betrayal was vaporizing in front of him, dismantled by a man who made $40 an hour. "It's a fabrication." Richard's voice was a weak, pathetic croak. "He altered the logs. He is a hacker. Intent doesn't erase impact." Jackson stepped away from the podium, his presence dominating the room. You bet everything on the assumption that a working-class father would abandon his integrity to save his dying child. You believed poverty breeds cowardice. You were wrong. The chairman reached for the heavy brass telephone resting in the center of the table. He did not dial security. He pressed the direct line to corporate counsel. Lock down all external routing protocols. Contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have an active internal embezzlement in progress. The chairman slammed the phone down. He looked at the two private security guards hovering nervously near the door. Detain Mr. Preston. If he attempts to leave this room before federal agents arrive, physically restrain him. The absolute collapse of power was a brutal, instantaneous spectacle. The aristocratic arrogance melted from Richard Preston's face, leaving behind a terrified, hollow shell. The guards advanced, stripping him of his platinum keycard, forcing him back into his chair. He didn't look at Sarah. He stared at the polished wood of the table, entirely broken. Jackson didn't stay to watch the carrion birds feast. He had executed the mission. He had protected the innocent. He reached down, ripping the flash drive from the podium, and turned his back on the billionaires. Sarah Mitchell intercepted him before he reached the heavy oak doors. The Ice Queen persona was entirely gone. She was trembling, a profound, overwhelming mixture of adrenaline, gratitude, and awe radiating from her. She looked up at the towering man in the faded suit, realizing the sheer, monumental magnitude of what he had just sacrificed to stand in this room. "Jackson," her voice cracked, tears finally spilling over the rigid, professional dam she had maintained for years. "You came. You actually came. I told you I finish what I start." Jackson's eyes softened, the warrior retreating, the father rushing back to the surface. He looked at the clock on the wall. 8:45 a.m. The surgery was already underway. The terror rushed back in, a cold, suffocating tide. "I have to go. My daughter is on the table." "Go!" Sarah reached out, her hand wrapping tightly around his wrist, a physical anchor in the storm. "The hospital administration will not touch that account. I overrode the termination an hour ago. She is safe. Go to her." Jackson nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. He pulled away, pushing through the heavy doors, breaking into a dead sprint the moment he hit the mahogany corridor. He flew down the freight elevator, burst through the loading dock doors, and sprinted the 3 blocks to his car, his lungs burning with the freezing Chicago wind. The waiting room of the pediatric cardiothoracic wing was a purgatory of vinyl chairs, stale coffee, and ticking clocks. Jackson sat in the corner, staring at the muted television screen. His hands clasped so tightly together his knuckles ached. Minutes stretched into hours. The adrenaline crash hit him like a physical blow, leaving him hollowed out, shivering in his suit. Every time the heavy double doors of the surgical theater swung open, his heart stopped, his breath catching in his throat, waiting for the devastating look of a surgeon delivering the worst news a human being can receive. At 1:15 p.m., the doors swung open. Dr. Aris, the lead cardiothoracic surgeon, walked into the waiting room, pulling down his blue surgical mask. He looked exhausted, his scrubs stained, but his eyes were bright. Jackson stood up, his legs entirely numb. The world narrowed to the space between him and the doctor. "Mr. Cole," the surgeon offered a weary, brilliant smile. The septal reconstruction was flawless, the donor valve seated perfectly. She is resting in recovery. Her pulse oxygen is at 99% on room air. She's going to have a long, beautiful life. The knees of the giant finally buckled. Jackson sank back into the vinyl chair, burying his face in his massive hands. A raw, guttural sob ripped through his chest, the accumulated terror of 7 years finally breaking free. He wept the heavy, agonizing tears of a man who had stared into the absolute abyss and somehow managed to pull his entire universe back from the edge. He had won. He had kept his honor, and he had saved his little girl. A gentle, hesitant pressure settled on his shoulder. Jackson lowered his hands, looking up through the blur of tears. Sarah Mitchell was standing beside his chair. She had stripped away the severe white blazer. Her hair was down, falling softly around her shoulders. She looked entirely out of place in the sterile, chaotic waiting room, and yet exactly where she belonged. "She's okay." Jackson's voice was a shattered, joyful whisper. "She's going to live." Sarah knelt down on the linoleum floor, entirely ignoring the ruin of her designer skirt. She looked at the giant weeping man, and the final lingering walls around her own heart simply dissolved. The loneliness of her entire adult life, the brutal, sterile pursuit of power, the devastating betrayal of Richard Preston, it all vanished, replaced by a profound, overwhelming clarity. "I know." Sarah's voice trembled. She reached out, her hands framing his face, her thumbs gently wiping the tears from his scarred cheeks. "I spoke to the nurses. They said she was incredibly brave." Jackson looked into her eyes. The cold, calculating corporate predator was gone. He saw a woman desperately yearning for the messy, beautiful chaos she had spent her life avoiding. "You came," Jackson echoed her words from the boardroom. "I couldn't be anywhere else." Sarah's breath hitched, the vulnerability absolute and terrifying. "Jackson, I spent my entire life building an empire because I thought it would protect me. I thought power was the only thing that couldn't betray you. But standing in that boardroom today, watching you risk everything you have, I realized I don't want an empire. I want this. I want the mess. I want the drawing on the refrigerator. I want the fear and the joy and the reality of a life actually lived." She paused, her hands gripping his face tighter. "I need you, not to save my career, not to fix my network. I need you because you are the only real thing I have ever known." Jackson stared at her. The air in the waiting room grew suddenly incredibly still. He remembered the sting of Naomi's loss, the vow he had made to never expose his heart to that magnitude of pain again. But looking at Sarah, seeing the absolute naked truth in her eyes, he recognized the profound courage it took for a woman like her to surrender her armor. He reached up, his large hands wrapping gently over hers. He gently pulled her hands away from his face, holding them tightly against his chest. "Look at me when you say it." Jackson's voice was low, a gentle but absolute command. "I don't want this to be an act. I don't want to be a savior, and I don't want a benefactor. I am a father first. My life is small, and it is hard. You have to be sure." Sarah didn't flinch. She leaned forward, the physical distance between them evaporating. Her eyes locked onto his, blazing with a fierce, unwavering light. "I am sure." Her voice was steady, anchored in absolute truth. "I want a family. I want you. Say it again, Jackson. Ask me again." "Are you sure?" "Yes." He pulled her into his arms. The embrace was entirely devoid of corporate calculation or desperate panic. It was a profound, foundational connection. Two people who had survived the absolute worst of the world, anchoring themselves to the best in each other. Jackson buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of jasmine and hospital antiseptic, feeling the frantic, vibrating anxiety in her body slowly melt into a deep, steady peace. 2 years later, the early Sunday morning sun washed over the meticulously manicured lawn of the sprawling two-story colonial in the Chicago suburbs. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming lilac bushes and freshly cut grass. The roar of the elevated train tracks and the chaotic siren songs of the South Side were a distant, fading memory. Jackson Cole stood on the wide wooden deck, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. He wore a simple, faded gray t-shirt and comfortable jeans. The deep lines of exhaustion that used to frame his eyes had softened, replaced by the quiet, steady contentment of a man who had fought his wars and returned home victorious. He was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was the chief information security officer for a massive global logistics firm, recruited heavily after the highly publicized dismantling of Richard Preston's embezzlement ring. He commanded a department of 80 engineers holding a seat at the executive table, his voice carrying the weight of a man whose integrity was a matter of public record. But his greatest victory was not playing out in a boardroom. In the center of the expansive green lawn, a 9-year-old girl was running full tilt. Chloe Cole was a blur of kinetic energy, her laughter ringing out clear and bright, entirely unhindered by the massive, invisible engine working perfectly in her chest. She chased a chaotic, incredibly clumsy golden retriever puppy waving a heavily chewed frisbee. The sliding glass door behind Jackson opened with a soft hiss. Sarah stepped out onto the deck. The severe blazers and pulled-back hair were relics of a past life. She wore a flowing, incredibly soft purple sundress, the color Chloe had always insisted she wear in the crayon drawings. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, catching the morning light. The sharp, guarded edges of the Ice Queen had vanished, replaced by a radiant, deeply rooted warmth. She rested one hand on the wooden railing, the other resting gently against the pronounced, beautiful swell of her 7-month pregnant belly. She's going to exhaust that poor dog before breakfast. Sarah leaned against Jackson's side, slipping her arm around his waist. Jackson wrapped his massive arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, resting his chin on the top of her head. He inhaled the scent of jasmine, feeling the strong, steady kick of his unborn chud pressing against his side. The dog knew what he signed up for. Jackson smiled, watching Chloe execute a spectacular tumbling dive onto the grass, wrapping her arms around the squirming puppy in a fit of absolute, unbridled joy. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the clear blue of the morning sky. "Are you happy, Jackson?" He looked at the sprawling yard, at the little girl whose heart beat with the fierce, unstoppable rhythm of a stolen second chance. He looked down at the woman who had traded an empire of ice for a house filled with chaotic, beautiful noise. He thought of Naomi and the promise he had made in the dark, sterile hospice room to build a life worth living. "You are allowed to be happy." Sarah whispered the words, a gentle echo of the permission they had both struggled so hard to grant themselves. Jackson tightened his grip around her shoulders, pulling her closer, anchoring himself completely in the profound, undeniable truth of the moment. Caring looks different from controlling. It looks like the messy, vibrant, undeniable reality unfolding in his backyard. "I have my dignity." Jackson's voice was a low, resonant hum of absolute peace. "I have my truth, and I have my family. The bad guys lost, Sarah. We won." Chloe spotted them on the deck. She scrambled to her feet, the puppy barking wildly at her heels. She waved the chewed frisbee in the air, her face splitting into a massive, brilliantly crooked smile. "Come play, Daddy. Come play, V." Jackson set his coffee mug on the wooden railing. He took his wife's hand, lacing his scarred fingers through hers. Together they stepped off the deck and walked out into the sunlight.